is CGTN, China Global Television Network. Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson heads back to Glasgow as leaders are urged to agree stronger carbon-cutting targets.
Our other headlines: win some, lose some. A mixed day for Google in multi-billion-dollar court cases involving the tracking of millions of iPhones.
Poland accuses Russia as Russia accuses the EU of creating a migrant crisis along the Belarus border.
And one of the biggest stock market debuts, shares for electric truck maker Rivian start trading in New York.
Britain has released a draft document of conclusions from the COP26 UN climate talks.
All this comes as UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson returns to Glasgow for the closing days of the summit.
Well, our correspondent Naweed Jabapal is in Scotland for us. So, Naweed, we now have the details of this draft conclusion document. What did it say?
Yeah, Robin, Boris Johnson deciding to take the train up today from London to come here to Glasgow. He was joined when he came to the summit by the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, showing the star power here to try and get this deal over the line. The draft communique that was published in the early hours of Wednesday. A few things. Let's start with coal usage and fossil fuels. It didn't give an exact date for that, but it wants the use of coal to be eradicated and also for subsidies for fossil fuels to be removed. Now, that's going to be problematic for energy producers, the likes of Saudi Arabia, where half of its economic revenue depends on oil exports. It's also going to be problematic for the likes of Australia. On the other hand, countries like India and China, major economies that need energy to grow and to continue on their development paths, as they say, they're not. That's going to be a concern for them as well. In terms of other goals from this document, it says that it wants all countries to review and to strengthen its targets for 2030. It says action here isn't quite quick enough, and it wants most countries around the world to be looking to be net zero when it comes to carbon emissions by or around 2050. Now, that's already at odds with the national plans that have been put in here over the past couple of weeks. And if you look at the money, financing is going to be another key issue. $100 billion was pledged all the way back in 2009 in Copenhagen at a similar meeting to this, and that hasn't been met. And that's another thing that this document is calling for richer nations to do more and stand by their commitments to help poorer nations deal with climate change.
So, Naweed, Boris Johnson back at the summit then, and he'll be hoping more can be achieved before Friday. How have the pledges made at COP26 been received?
Yeah, well, the idea really was to try and come here and put some impetus back into these negotiations to get these nearly 200 countries to work together and push this over the line. Already, though, his journey here is drawing some criticism. One of the Labour opposition members, Ed Miliband, who is the shadow business secretary here, he says that this shouldn't just be a day trip, that he should stay here for the entire rest of the summit. That's something that Nicola Sturgeon, the Scottish First Minister, has also said. But aside from that, in terms of how it's going to go down, there are plenty of countries here and plenty of disagreements to iron out. Activists from the campaign group Greenpeace say Saudi Arabia is one country that's holding up the talks. Its energy minister turning up here and saying that that was completely fabricated and that those were lies. So there are still plenty of issues to try and iron out. But fundamentally, I think when it comes to dealing with the issue, most of the countries need to be looking at future priorities and working together. That's something that was put to me by one of the leading climate change economists around the world, someone who's been looking into this issue for almost 20 years now, and he said if there was going to be achievement, remember what's being discussed here at COP26 is actually trying to deal with what was agreed in Paris in 2015 and that Copenhagen meeting in 2009. So this is essentially trying to push that forward, and he said for that to happen, then countries were going to have to put aside their differences and work together.
Late. It's running about 80 billion now, and we're 2021. It's supposed to be done by 2020. Of course, COVID came along. We have to recognise that. And the best guess now is that 100 billion could be delivered next year, 2022, but will be delivered in 2023. Now that's 3 years too late, and that's reprehensible, and that's a breach of trust. But the first thing is deliver on that, but that is coming, But now we have to look beyond that, and we have to think of all the forms of finance, from the bilaterals, that means, from donor to recipient directly, through the multilaterals, through the multilateral development banks, bringing in the private sector, and new forms of money like special drawing rights, voluntary carbon markets, philanthropy and so on.
And you've had the opportunity to work in both India and China, two countries that have been criticised for not being ambitious enough here. Do you think that there needs to be more of an understanding of the drivers that are influencing policymakers in those two countries and the needs that they have?
Absolutely. India and China are the two most important countries in the world. By far the biggest populations, very different countries, very different ambitions, needs, structures of their economy. But Prime Minister Modi's speech last week for India, where they're going to cut emissions per unit of output by 45% this decade, means that they're going to peak emissions around 2030. China has consistently said before 2060 for carbon neutrality, peaking before 2030. I believe China will peak well before 2030. I hope by 2025. That would be a tremendous step forward.
And you authored a landmark review into the economics of climate change back in 2006. I'm just going to read a bit of the simple conclusion you reached. Quote, the benefits of strong and early action far outweigh the economic costs of not acting. 15 years later, and we're still hearing the same concerns.
Oh, actually, it's even stronger now, because the costs of things like renewables have come right down, and the costs of inaction, we understand year by year, are even more severe than we thought before. So that statement was absolutely clearly right then, and it's just been underlined and underlined ever since.
And there's still a lot of people out there who are sceptical about climate change and the politics of it all. What would your simple message be to them?
Well, wake up and understand science.
That was Nicholas Stern, author of a 2006 report on the economics of climate change, talking to our correspondent, Naweed Jabalkil.
Google has lost a multi-billion-dollar battle with the European Union. The EU's court rejected an appeal by the tech giant over an antitrust breach in 2017. It found the Commission was right to penalise Google for favouring its own price comparison shopping service over smaller European rivals. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Giles Gibson in Brussels, who's watching the story for us. Giles, why did the court uphold this fine against Google?
Well, Jamie, this court, which is actually the second highest court in the European Union, said that it dismissed this appeal from Google against this massive fine because the conduct in question was adopted intentionally, not negligently. Of course, as you would expect, the European Commission has welcomed this decision from this court in Luxembourg, backing up its original fine, which was issued back in 2017 at 2.4 billion euros. At the time, it said that Google had unfairly favoured its shopping service at the expense of rivals. When Google actually launched its appeal against this massive fine from the European Commission, it said that the fine was wrong on the law, the facts and the economics. The company, in the wake of this ruling, which came out several hours ago, has said that it is going to go away and study the ruling, and then it's not clear at this stage whether the company is going to appeal this and take it up to the highest court in the European Union, the European Court of Justice.
And what are the wider consequences of this legal ruling?
Well, this is certainly a big win, Jamie, for Margrethe Vestager, who is the European Commissioner for Competition, because she had actually lost a case in this exact same court involving Apple and the amount of tax that it's supposed to be paying in the Republic of Ireland. This is also the first of 3 decisions that we're expecting from this court in Luxembourg involving Google. EU authorities have also fined the company over the last few years for the things to do with its Android system as well as its advertising services. The company has also appealed both of those fines as well. And this also just gives a lot of momentum to Margrethe Vestager as she pursues other investigations, other antitrust investigations into some other really big tech firms such as Apple, Facebook and Amazon.
Giles Gibson in Brussels, thank you very much.
Well, it's not all bad news for Google. The UK's top court has backed its appeal against a $4.3 billion class action lawsuit for alleged privacy breaches. The landmark case argued that Google secretly tracked the internet activity of more than 5 million iPhone users between 2011 and 2012, using the data for commercial purposes. But the court found that the claimants had not proven financial loss or distress. It's one of a string of similar claims waiting to be launched against large tech companies, including Facebook and TikTok. Well, Chris Stoker-Walker is a tech author and journalist, and he joins us live now. Welcome back to the programme, Chris. So, Google, as we've been hearing, facing multiple cases. Let's start with the one we just mentioned. So Google did win, but the verdict didn't deal with whether they did actually track millions of phones.
This is one of the key elements that was left unsaid and unconcluded as a result of that. I think we know from our history with technology that if you are not paying for something, for a product, then you are probably the product yourself. You give over your data in exchange for free access to things, and we are increasingly used to that. Obviously, this case particularly interesting in terms of what it tells us about successes against tech companies, particularly in contrast to the European case. I think it kind of says that individuals trying to tackle and take on big tech maybe struggle a little bit, but when it's a little bit more organised through politicians and political might, maybe there's some success there.
So why did this case go Google's way?
The judges in the Supreme Court essentially saying that there wasn't actually proof of this. The idea that was brought and towards the Supreme Court was that every single person who has had an iPhone should be given money in order to make up for some supposed use of their data. But the judgment basically said that there wasn't actually any definitive proof provided by the people who brought this large claim against Google that had actually happened. And again, it is kind of interestingly in contrast with the European Union, who have got all their ducks in a row. They've organised everything very carefully and they've supported their claims with concrete evidence.
So let's talk about that case then. Google lost its appeal, of course. What are the implications for Google?
I think it's pretty significant because it does show, and we've talked about this in the past, and there have been many, many stories, a drumbeat continually pounding in the background of this battle between big tech and big government. And we're starting to see big government cutting down big tech to a little bit more of its own size. And what's particularly interesting, as we've highlighted, not just in the package, but also in the comments from the correspondent, Jamie, was talking to Jamie about kind of the impact that the European Union is having on big tech because it is able to concretely prove these things. Margrethe Vestager is putting a lot of effort into trying to tackle big tech. And ultimately what she's doing is, I think, taking it in a much more slow approach. She is considering everything important. She is putting into place all the evidence that she needs rather than some of these more knee-jerk reactions to tech, and actually is managing to bring big tech down because of it.
So does this case, in a way, open the door for the EU to take further action on both Google and other tech giants?
Yeah, well, as was highlighted, there are several other cases that are currently in play, particularly around Google. Obviously, Apple managed to win their case, as was mentioned in the past, but I think that this shows that there is a precedent to actually bring an issue against a big tech company, whether it's Google or Facebook now, Meta or any of the others, TikTok included. And we do see that impact having a real effect, because what is essentially happening is these attempts to bring big tech to heel are proving to be successful. They are not being rolled back in the way that perhaps we've seen other ones done. And I think that is because there is a justification for this. You know, big tech does have a few questions to answer. It's just a case of whether the people interrogating them have the technical know-how to be able to prove that and to really make them answer those difficult questions.
Chris Stoker-Walker, thanks very much indeed for joining us on the programme today.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the world's shopping bonanza. China's biggest import expo finishes with deals signed worth tens of billions of dollars.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more...
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us, excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
This is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
Climate change is happening right now. World leaders are holding vital talks that will change the course of humanity. Action could save millions of lives. Failure could cost many more. Do they have the will to act quickly? Does the climate have the time to wait? Follow full coverage from the COP26 climate talks here on CGTN.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms. On Smart TV or online at Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Poland's Prime Minister has accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of masterminding the flow of migrants heading towards EU borders. But the Kremlin is blaming Europe.
At least 2,000 migrants are gathered at the border between Poland and Belarus. Both Poland and Lithuania have now declared a state of emergency on their borders.
Well, CGTN's Linda Kennedy is in Budapest and Julia Chapman is in Moscow for us. But first of all, let's talk with you, Linda. So what's the latest from the Belarus-Poland border?
Most of the 2,000 migrants that are still on the border are at the area around Kuznitsa, which is the official border crossing that was closed earlier this week. Last night, the temperatures there dropped to -2 degrees. There is not very much food. There is not a great amount of shelter, just tents for the refugees to be sleeping in. And at night, when the temperatures get very low, they are using wood from the forest to make fires to try to keep warm. According to the Polish Defence Minister, it was not a calm night last night with attempts to breach the border. This comes, of course, after the Polish Prime Minister has said that Belarus are using these migrants as human shields and accusing Russia of being the mastermind behind it all. These people are, to use the words of the EU, people who have been enticed into a dangerous trap, encouraged to come to Minsk and then to be driven to the border, where they've actually been describing today how that's gone, about how they were driven in cars and vans, and then when they were close to the border just told to get out, and they were pointed towards the border and told to try to cross.
Meanwhile, neighbouring Lithuania is also getting ready for an influx of migrants. What can you tell us?
Lithuania also has a frontier with Belarus, and they declared a state of emergency, which began at midnight last night local time. And they report that they had 281 attempts to cross the border last night, a much higher number than usual. They too have sent troops to the border. The Prime Minister, Ingrida Shimon-Ite, went to visit those troops today at the border, and the Parliament has put particular conditions into the state of emergency. They have allowed border guards to use what they call proportional physical violence and mental coercion against any migrants who try to get across. The state of emergency is currently in place for a month. It may have to be extended.
Linda Kennedy in Budapest, thank you.
Well, let's get the reaction from Moscow now and talk to our correspondent, Julia Chapman. Julia, Poland's Prime Minister accusing Vladimir Putin for being behind this crisis, but the Kremlin blaming the EU. What more can you tell us?
The Kremlin has called that comment unacceptable. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that it is Europe that is creating a looming humanitarian crisis by failing to live up to European values. And he said that these criticisms of Belarus were an attempt to strangle the country. Those words were echoed in a press conference here in Moscow today between the foreign ministers of Belarus and Russia, with Russia's Sergei Lavrov saying this was the EU trying to demonstrate its sense of superiority and impunity. Vladimir Makai of Belarus said that any criticism that Belarus is trying to orchestrate this migrant crisis by facilitating the movement of migrants into Belarus and towards the border was just an attempt by the European Union to create a pretext for further sanctions. And those sanctions are indeed on the table and will be discussed at a meeting on Monday of European Union foreign ministers. It's a meeting that has long been planned to discuss many issues, including Belarus, including extending sanctions, which were already in place over human rights abuses in the country dating back to last year. But there is certainly a sense that there could be new sanctions on the table that may go beyond just Belarus, but could extend to any airlines or other organizations helping facilitate the movement of these migrants.
Vladimir Putin has spoken to the German Chancellor Angela Merkel. Do we know what was said?
Well, there were different readouts from both sides. The German Chancellery saying that Angela Merkel urged President Vladimir Putin to put pressure on Minsk. She said that the instrumentalization of migrants was inhumane and unacceptable. There was no reference to pressure from the Kremlin readout, but it did say that concern was expressed about the humanitarian situation, and President Putin said that he supports direct dialogue between European countries and Minsk. But in a show of how Russia is viewing this whole situation, the Russian Ministry of Defense today sent 2 long-range bombers for a patrol over Belarus, sending quite a strong signal to the European Union that Russia is going to back Belarus in this crisis.
Julia Chapman in Moscow, thank you very much.
The UN's High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, has been speaking to the European Parliament about the crisis in Belarus. He says EU countries must uphold the rule of law when faced with migrants trying to enter the EU.
It is unacceptable that the dangerous onward movement of vulnerable people be encouraged by states. In this respect, yesterday, UNHCR and the International Organization for Migration have appealed for an urgent resolution of the situation at the border between Belarus and Poland, and for immediate, unhindered access to people on the move to ensure provision of humanitarian assistance, identification of those in need of protection, and access to procedures in Belarus for those there who wish to seek asylum.
China has reported a rise in inflation for October, driven by rising supply chain and energy costs, plus the impact of recent flooding on agriculture. The consumer price index more than doubled from September to 1.5% to a 13-month high. However, China's National Bureau of Statistics says food prices are still lower than they were a year ago. The producer price index, which deals with the cost of manufacturing, also rose, up 13.5% from October last year.
China's gaming and social media giant Tencent has reported a 3% increase in quarterly profits, its slowest growth in 2 years. The company says it's had to adjust to a series of regulatory crackdowns by Beijing, which has restricted its gaming operations. Tencent's revenue rose 13% to $22.3 billion for the 3 months to September.
German government advisers have cut the country's economic growth forecast for 2021 to 2.7%. That's down from the 3.1% predicted in March. Germany's recovery from the pandemic has been slower than expected amid higher energy prices and supply chain problems.
Shares in the UK retailer Marks & Spencer jumped as much as 21% after it beat its profit forecast for the first half of this year. M&S also increased its full-year profit guidance to $675 million, up from a previous estimate of $470 million. But it's cautioned that cost pressures are increasing and dividend payments in the current year remain unlikely.
French President Emmanuel Macron says everyone over the age of 65 will need to get a COVID booster shot to qualify for a health passport, allowing access to restaurants, trains and planes. He's also urged the roughly 6 million unvaccinated French to accept shots as a fifth wave of infections spreads across Europe. CGTN's Ross Cullen reports.
This was Emmanuel Macron's 9th address to the nation since the start of the pandemic. His last speech was in July, as a fourth wave of cases was starting to hit France. This one comes as a new surge of infections is impacting France specifically and Europe as a whole. Now, he says, from the middle of December, the over 65s will have to get a third dose of a coronavirus vaccine if they want to keep their health pass. Now, this pass is required to access bars, cafes, restaurants, cinemas, museums and sports centres. The French president says the rising COVID-19 incidence rate and rising hospitalisations in France are alert signals that the government has to confront. He also announced that booster vaccination appointments for people aged 50 to 64 would be available from early December.
All the studies show that 6 months after the vaccine, immunity decreases, and therefore the risk of developing a serious form increases again. The solution to this drop in immunity is the injection of an additional dose of vaccine, the so-called booster. A campaign was launched at the end of the summer for all those over 65 and the most vulnerable, and we now need to speed it up.
There was an immediate impact. 100,000 COVID-19 vaccination appointments were booked in the hour after the president's address. Now, governments across Europe are watching the rising COVID-19 cases with concern as winter approaches, when more people will be together inside confined spaces. Millions are travelling during the festive period, and seasonal flu comes into play again. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, is this a new dawn for hydrogen as the UK looks to invest huge sums in alternative fuels?
It's the first day in Germany that vaccination centers like this one are offering a third jab.
There are fears there could be a fifth wave of COVID-19 cases.
Market watchers have a keen eye on infection rates,
safety and efficacy of COVID-19 shots. France closed schools in the first lockdown in spring last year. France has been a leader in vaccinating youngsters.
If a spike necessitates another lockdown,
Italy is now close to reaching its target of immunising 80% of the population over the age of 12.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
The agreement is signed. But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Robin Dwyer. The headlines again. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson heads back to Glasgow as COP26 leaders are urged to agree stronger carbon-cutting targets.
Win some, lose some, a mixed day for Google in multi-billion-dollar court cases involving the tracking of millions of iPhones.
And Poland accuses Russia as Russia accuses the EU of creating a migrants' crisis along the Belarus border.
The US electric truck maker Rivian is set to start trading on the New York Stock Exchange after raising nearly $12 billion from investors. The shares are being priced at $78, placing the startup among the United States' top 10 IPOs of all time. Well, let's talk to our correspondent John Terrace in New York. John, will Rivian's blockbuster IPO make it the next Tesla?
Well, it's funny you should mention that, actually, because I think we all thought that Tesla might be a bit of a threat to it, and it isn't really turning out that way. Let me tell you why. I mean, the really interesting thing is that Rivian lost $900 million in the last 6 months. It doesn't bode well, does it, when you hear that? But 900, that's an awful lot of money to lose. But they did lose it. They're based in some very glamorous locations as well: California, Illinois, Michigan, and Woking in Surrey, which I think is probably the most glamorous of them all. But, you know, there is really huge excitement about them coming to market here. Not here, we're at the stock exchange, but up the road in Times Square at the NASDAQ. That's where they're having their IPO. And the reason for the huge excitement is the people backing them. Because Amazon has sunk 20% into the company. The Ford Motor Company has pumped in $8 billion. General Motors is there as well. And there are investment companies like T. Rowe Price, who you may have heard of, and also Franklin Templeton. So you're right, this is one of the biggest IPOs of the year so far at the NASDAQ. Now, these numbers always fluctuate a little bit. So what I have here is what you said, that they plan to go out at $78. I'm hearing that it may open as high as $120. It hasn't opened just yet. That's the indicated price now, $120. So that would make it worth in the region of $70 to $80 billion, and they'll raise around $12 billion. And they could be worth more than the Ford Motor Company and General Motors by the end of the day, which does seem extraordinary. And you do have to remember something, and it's hard. It's a hard lesson to learn. But Tesla did not make a profit until last year, and the investors and the bankers stuck with them, and they were formed in 2003, so like 17 years before they made a profit. So I guess that the thinking is the same thing here, Jamie and Robin.
That's very sobering. John, Americans love their SUVs, their trucks. They're launching into a very crowded marketplace, aren't they?
Yeah. Well, they are, but that's the thing. You hit the nail on the head there, because it is a very crowded marketplace, this electric vehicle marketplace. Everyone, the world and his wife, wants to make one. And I think what's going to happen is, in the end, the big names in each country will end up prevailing. But the thing about Rivian is, it is into trucks only. Now, in America, trucks mean everything from those huge things you see thundering up the M1 in the UK to a family-sized vehicle. If you have a big vehicle, maybe 5 or 6 kids, and you would buy what Americans call a truck to drive them around in. Now, Rivian's promising 3 new vehicles before the end of the year, and now we come to the bit that everybody wants to realize, because Amazon, who's backed 20% of them so far, as you know, has already ordered 100,000 of their new electric vehicle trucks once they're produced. So that's a pretty good thing to have in the bag already, which hence the excitement I was telling you about just now. And all this comes as Tesla seems to be falling apart a little bit at the moment. Shares were down 12% yesterday. Now, today they are actually up 5%. This is all over some bizarre Twitter thing that is going on, in which Elon Musk asked Twitter to poll him and tell him whether he should sell 10% of his stock in Tesla, which is about $21 billion. We think that that's so he can pay off taxes early because they're undoubtedly going up. We don't know for certain. But Twitter said, yes, sell your stock. So that's rather confused investors, although I don't think it's probably very serious long term because Tesla is in a very good position at the moment. And as I said, we thought that it may end up, because they're producing a truck as well, maybe a rival to Rivian, but doesn't seem to be so far.
And while you're there, John, a quick word about inflation, which seems to be hitting record levels.
I know. I have to tell you, the authorities here, that's the White House and the Treasury and the Central Bank, all talk about inflation being transitory. I mean, I tell you what, it does not feel like it. Everything is going up here, from your coffee down the road at a coffee house to fuel in your car, to your university education, to I parked my car yesterday in New York for the first time. It was $10 more than it was last month. So we've got CPI, that's consumer price inflation, up 6.2% in October. That's the biggest rise since December 1990. Energy, shelter, food, vehicles, all responsible. Yesterday we had wholesale inflation, that's PPI. That was hitting a record as well. It was up 0.6% in October, 8.6% year on year. That's the biggest joint it's ever been, that is to say, the joint biggest hike it's ever been. Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is now looking to the second half of 2022 for inflation to stabilise. That's far longer than we thought. Demand, supply chain issues and commodity prices are the reason, we are told. Guys?
John, good to see you. John Terrett there for us in New York.
The Vice President of the United States is to hold talks with the French President at a time when relations between the two countries are under pressure. Kamala Harris is on a visit to France to try and repair the diplomatic damage done by a defence deal between the United States, UK and Australia. The deal saw Australia opt out of a multi-billion-dollar agreement to buy French submarines.
The United Nations says more than 70 drivers working for its World Food Programme are being held by the Ethiopian government. The news comes a day after the UN condemned the detention of at least 16 of its staff by Ethiopian authorities. The country declared a state of emergency earlier this month, which permits the government to arrest anyone suspecting of working with a terrorist group.
Ministers from the Asia-Pacific Trade Group, APEC, have pledged to make vaccines more accessible to boost the region's pandemic recovery. The group of 21 countries includes the United States, China and Australia. It's holding a series of virtual conferences hosted by New Zealand, during which ministers also committed to reducing carbon emissions.
Germany has recommended people under the age of 30 only receive the Pfizer coronavirus jab. The country's Vaccine Advisory Committee says it had a lower risk than the Moderna vaccine of heart inflammation in young people. The committee also recommended pregnant women only receive the Pfizer jab. This comes a day after French health authorities advised against the Moderna vaccine for the under 30s.
Staying with Germany, and its future direction is expected to be settled in the coming hours. Negotiators from 3 of Germany's main political parties are expected to outline a broad coalition agreement. Details of the so-called traffic light coalition will then be hammered out by leaders of the Social Democrats, Free Democrats and Greens, with hopes of a final deal by December. Well, let's talk now to our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin. So, Trent, are we any closer to knowing how this is all going to look?
Well, Robin, we certainly are getting closer. The deadline is just under 30 minutes now for those final submissions to be sent to the head of the 3 parties. It follows about 2 weeks of negotiations between representatives of the party in key policy areas. We've had over 20 working groups working on everything from the environment to the economy to health to law and justice, and they're all trying to find a common path for that future coalition government. Of course, when you've got 3 parties in the room, though, it can be difficult to get agreement. That is why it has taken a while since we should be able to see the results of these negotiations. We understand one of the main issues of contention does remain climate change, with the Greens, of course, one of the major players in that 3-party coalition, pushing for heavier action on climate change. But we understand there is some pushback, especially in relation to the divvying up of powers between a future environment ministry and a future economy ministry.
And Trent, this is all going on while Germany goes through a 4th wave of COVID-19. Has this impacted negotiations?
It certainly has, and I think in many ways it's starting to cast a shadow over the negotiations in the sense that it is really taking up priority now in terms of where the focus is headed. We are seeing some extraordinary numbers coming out of Germany, especially over the past few days. I mean, just today, almost 40,000 new cases. That is the highest the country has seen, not just this month or this year, but throughout the entire pandemic. Hospitals now are also starting to cancel day surgeries because they are feeling the pressure. In Bavaria, one of Germany's largest states, the premier down there has just declared a disaster which would allow civil agencies to work closer together to try and coordinate the health system and protecting it throughout this quite troubled period. So right now we understand that some senior health voices are calling for further restrictions to be introduced, including Christian Drosten, the head of virology at Berlin's Charité Hospital where I am. He's a very influential voice in the German health system. So far, politicians are not keen to go back down that path in relation to a lockdown, instead really trying to push the boosters out to the population. But of course, we really are just weeks away from a change of government. And so where Olaf Scholz, the likely next chancellor, takes us in this next phase of the pandemic really does remain to be seen.
Trent, good to talk to you. Trent Murray there in Berlin.
Japan's Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has been formally re-elected and has chosen his new cabinet after a better-than-expected performance for his Liberal Democrat Party in this month's general election. Kishida is seen to be on a stronger footing, and he plans to push forward new economic policies. Phoebe Amoroso reports now from Tokyo.
While the re-election of Kishida was a formality, the Prime Minister is on much stronger footing and he's looking to make some changes. One change is the appointment of Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi. The former Education Minister is known for his pro-China stance. Now, Kishida has previously said that he wants to strengthen dialogue with Beijing, so analysts say that this choice really reflects that strategy. Addressing the nation, Kishida has laid out further details of his vision. He says that the government is looking to strengthen its response to COVID-19 as an utmost priority. They're looking to increase hospital bed capacity by 30% compared to the summer levels when the healthcare system really was overwhelmed. The economy is another major focus. Kishida is aiming to get together a stimulus package worth over $265 billion by the end of next week. He has a vision for so-called new capitalism, which involves both growth and distribution. One key strategy will be pushing the private sector to raise wages and giving tax credits to companies that comply. The LDP has just reached an agreement with its coalition partner Komeito regarding cash handouts. Those aged 18 and under will be eligible, excluding high-income households. And Kishida says he's now looking to extend a similar kind of support to students who are struggling financially. Analysts say, however, that Kishida does not have a free pass. He will need to tread carefully around party heavyweights, particularly former Prime Minister Abe. But Kishida has promised that he will unveil new policies that are different from his predecessors, and the public are waiting to find out exactly how. Phoebe Amoroso, CGTN, Tokyo.
Now it's the world's largest shop window, now shut for another year in Shanghai. Nearly 3,000 businesses from around the world took part in the China International Import Expo, forging hundreds of new partnerships in areas like healthcare, digital technology, sports and services. Our reporter Yang Chun-si reports.
This marks the end of one of China's biggest business events of the year. Organizers say some 480,000 people visited the expo, and tentative deals worth $70.7 billion were signed.
The pavilion of the Import Expo is a very lively place because every few minutes there is a deal signing ceremony.
The medical pavilion offered 135 new products and technologies. That's the highest among all pavilions.
German-based medical firm Boehringer Ingelheim signed a deal with a district government in southwest China's Chengdu city for a stroke rehabilitation center.
I think CIE represents a great opportunity to meet different provincial governments and also different partners. So it brings together the important stakeholders for future development.
Chinese purchasers also hailed the SIIE as a platform to deepen strategic relations with foreign partners.
If it weren't for this platform, our collaboration with that partner would be limited to a technical level. But thanks to the Expo, we have now built strategic collaborations.
The annual CIIE has been running since 2018, and each year we've seen a growing number of exhibitors utilizing this giant expo and the latest technologies to expand their business opportunities. Some have used live streaming in their pavilions to promote companies and products, and even to recruit potential talents.
The use of new technologies was not limited to exhibitors. Expo organizers also made good use of them. Because of the ongoing pandemic, organizers set up online exhibitions for participating countries and international institutions for the first time.
China's virtual pavilion was welcomed by many people both at home and abroad. The site has been visited over 58 million times.
It's been 4 years since the first Import Expo was held, and since then, the event has become more versatile in finding new ways to promote business. Yang Chengxi, CGTN, Shanghai.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, how to save you money and save the planet. The man on a mission to stop food waste.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson is speaking right now at the Climate Summit in Glasgow, giving an update on progress, or perhaps the lack of it. Let's listen in to what he has to say.
And where we need to be if we're going to cut emissions in half by 2030. And we need to pull out all the stops if we're going to do what we came here to do, and that's keep 1.5 alive and make Paris the success that the world needs it to be, because that 2015 agreement in Paris was a significant moment in the fight against climate change, but it was ultimately a pledge of action still to come. And it's very frustrating to see countries that have spent 6 years conspicuously patting themselves on the back for signing that promissory note in Paris, quietly edging towards default, now that vulnerable nations and future generations are demanding payment here now in Glasgow. And there's really no excuse, because we know what is at stake here. We've been hearing it all week. We heard it from the president of Palau, Siranga Whips, who told me he spent 5 days traveling 7,500 miles across 9 time zones to make sure that the voice of his people was heard. And the least we can do is pay attention when he says that if the big economies don't do more, we, and I quote, might as well bomb his islands. We heard it from Simon Coffey from the government of Tuvalu, who spoke to us not from a podium in a cosy conference room, but knee-deep in a steadily rising Pacific Ocean. And we heard it from the Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, who so moved us on the opening ceremony when she warned that we are digging our own graves and asked, when are the leaders finally going to lead? And so I say to my fellow leaders, if you stood and applauded her then, you cannot now sit on your hands as the world asks you to act, because the world knows what a mess our planet is in. The world has heard leaders from every country, continent, stand here and acknowledge the need for action, and the world will find it absolutely incomprehensible if we fail to deliver that, and the backlash from people will be immense and it will be long-lasting. And frankly, we will deserve their criticism and their opprobrium, because we know what needs to be done, and we all agree what needs to be done. We just need the courage actually to get on and do it. So now is the time for everyone to come together and show the determination needed to power on through the blockages, to look at the science with dispassionate eyes and think about how we can compromise, how we can be flexible to meet the needs of the planet. And for world leaders...
You've been watching live coverage of UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson addressing the climate summit in Glasgow after the first draft of the climate change agreement was published. Boris Johnson saying they are firmly in the hard yards, saying the nuts and bolts of international climate diplomacy negotiations are getting tough and there is much still to do. That draft agreement, by the way, expressing alarm and concern that humans have caused warming of 1.1 degrees already, and says impacts are being felt everywhere. Anyway, we'll have much more analysis on Boris Johnson's speech later here on CGTN.
In the build-up to this year's COP26 conference, the UK said it would throw its weight behind hydrogen power as part of its renewable energy mix.
It's a technology that's had many false dawns, but could it be different this time? CGTN's Guy Henderson reports.
A pilot project to heat the UK's Keele University with the help of hydrogen. Mixed with natural gas and using existing pipeline infrastructure, those involved see its successful completion as a showcase to encourage wider use.
One of the key things which is needed is the increased production of hydrogen, but we also need to ensure that that is a low-carbon production of hydrogen.
Domestic heating accounts for about a third of the UK's total emissions. If it's to hit net zero by 2050 as planned, that's going to have to change. So the British government wants to unlock some $124 billion in investment to build up more alternative energy sources. Only this week it threw its weight behind the development of a modular nuclear reactor, which could itself make low-carbon hydrogen production more viable.
We know will deliver zero-carbon electricity, and we know that there's a huge demand for zero-carbon electricity with all the different technologies that are being touted at COP at the moment, hydrogen, synthetic fuels, and so on. And you know, that's the gap that Rolls-Royce SMR can plug.
Because while burning hydrogen produces water, making it in the first place can release a lot of CO2. Norwegian energy firm Equinor plans to overcome that challenge at scale by building one of the largest hydrogen production sites in the world in the north of England, while using carbon capture and storage technology to limit emissions. This winter's energy supply crunch has added new urgency, with experts warning renewable capacity is still lacking and that more must be done to fill the post-fossil fuel gap. Cleaner production could clear the path for all kinds of other uses, from heavy industry to transport. In June, Toyota launched the Mirai, its latest hydrogen fuel cell car. The jury's still out on whether they'll ever be common on UK roads, though. There are only a handful of hydrogen filling stations for starters, including this one run by oil giant Shell. Back in Keele, though, hydrogen proponents say there's no time to wait and see.
There's a tendency to try and sort of play these technologies off against each other. But actually, you know, I think what is really clear is we need everything, and we need to be deploying everything that we can as soon as possible.
Hydrogen power has had false dawns before. This time there's a new urgency in the UK and elsewhere to make it mainstream. Di Henderson, CGTN.
As part of our climate coverage, we're profiling people who are trying to make a real difference when it comes to saving the planet. The Real Junk Food Project was established by Adam Smith in a bid to end food poverty. It's a grocery shop, cafe and catering business where customers pay as much or as little as they like for surplus food that would otherwise be thrown away.
My name's Adam Smith and I'm the founder and chief executive of the Real Junk Food Project. So the idea came when I was working in Australia. I was a chef in 2012. I had to go work on a pig farm and the pigs were getting fed food that was still perfectly fine to eat but wasted from neighbouring farms, and I kind of questioned why this perfectly edible food was being wasted. I just said I'm going to create the Real Junk Food Project. I'm going to feed the world, but in a very radical and unique way. Rather than trying to feed poor people with waste food, I was going to expose the environmental issues with food waste. So this is the Kindness Warehouse. We don't take donations of food, we intercept food that's going to waste, so that's surplus. So that could be food that's had accidental damage, past best before, or just surplus to requirements. And we've got vehicles on the road at all times. We collect it from supermarkets, wholesalers, farms, hospitality, people's houses. We bring it here and then we weigh it, record it, quality control it, and then if it's fit for human consumption, we'll get it out and we'll feed people's bellies and as quickly as possible. And we do lots and lots of different things. We do redistribution, so we give food to other charities. We cater for weddings and funerals and events. And we also build boxes for families as well, and people could come down and purchase a box. So we've done around 7,000 tonnes of food in 7 years, in 7 countries. There's a lot of sevens there, and that's around 16.5 to 17 million meals of food that would have gone to waste that we've prevented from happening. So we're about 16.5 million meals, I think, in total, which is fantastic, but also we should never have been allowed to do that. I always say to people that growth isn't a sign of success for us. Success would be if we were no longer here. If I could close this warehouse and we could all work in a bank or a post office and we didn't have to do this anymore, I think far too many people in society would rather just carry on, and regardless until the end, really. For me, these meetings, these UN summits and COPs, I don't really think much of them, because I just feel like it's a lot of people sat around talking about the problem, and there needs to be more people actually doing something. More people growing food, less people shopping at supermarkets, less people in their cars. I think for me, the choice is you either be part of the solution or you be part of the problem. And unfortunately, I don't think there's enough people who are part of the solution.
The headlines again. While we've been on air, UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson has been speaking in Glasgow as COP26 leaders are urged to agree stronger carbon reduction targets.
Win some, lose some. Mixed day for Google in multi-billion-dollar court cases involving the tracking of millions of iPhones.
And Poland accuses Russia as Russia accuses the EU of creating a migrant crisis along the Belarus border.
Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps, Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app, and in the UK on Freeview.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.
Goodbye.